Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. We had last week, we had the Democratic National Convention, identitarian politics, virtue signaling, and Trump is very, very bad. Okay, all of that was expected, very little policy. In the area of foreign policy, we had a Republican diehard never Trumpers, neoconservatives come shore up the Democrats. Now we have this week the Republicans and Mike Pompeo, the current Secretary of State from Jerusalem, an obvious violation of the Hatch Act, gave the Trump foreign policy, however you really want to define it, because I think it's very undefined. So to discuss this and more, I'm joined by John Laughland. He is a scholar and commentator, and we have George Szameuly, of course. Let me go to you first, John. I mean, none of this is surprising, but what's really shameful is that when we had the last three presidential election cycles, it was clear voters voted against interventions, against forever wars, against this kind of muscular foreign policy. And here we go again. It's not discussed, and what is discussed is the same propaganda talking points on both sides. Go ahead, John.
Well, basically, I think you're right. I've said for years, including on your show, that Trump agrees with neocons on a lot of issues. He especially agrees with them on the concept of full spectrum dominance. He said repeatedly that he wants the United States to dominate the rest of the world and to be in a position of such strength that no opponent or even coalition of opponents could ever oppose him. And he's made that abundantly clear. And of course, the second thing that he agrees with them very strongly on is obviously Israel. He's a very strong supporter of Israel, and he's always said that, and we've always known that, and so on. And as you rightly say, Peter, in your question, you know, Mike Pompeo is straight out of that stable. He's not just, you know, he supports this neocon foreign policy, but of course, above all, I would say he's a former director of the CIA, as we know. So there's a lot of continuity. However, I think one has to also add, but it's a bit of a nuance, but I think it's worth saying that actually there hasn't been a war under Trump. There has not been a war. There's been a lot of pressure for war. There hasn't been a war. And Trump, not only has there not been a war, but Trump has said, for example, on Korea and with respect to North Korea and with respect to John Bolton, he has said, if it hadn't been for me, there would have been a war, referring, as I say, to North Korea and possibly I think to Venezuela. But he has, in other words, put forward his anti-war credentials as part of his own package. And I think we have to take that on board. You know, of course, one would wish for more. I would definitely wish for more. But the fact remains that he hasn't, apart from, you know, there was, as we know, a bomb attack on Syria a couple of years ago at Easter. There was obviously the assassination of the Iranian general in Baghdad a few months ago. These things we can be against. But when you compare them to the obvious precedents, Iraq, Libya, Kosovo, and so on, and above all, Ukraine, I think we have to say, as neutral observers, that he is not as bad as he could have been.
Yeah,
and
but that's a pretty low bar. But I agree with you here, George. What I found really fascinating in what CNN and MSNBC, and to a great extent Fox, essentially censored Rand Paul in his speech. Which I thought was a brilliant speech. I thought it was very measured. It was had a sense of gravity to it that you didn't see with anyone else speaking at either one of these conventions thus far. But it was really interesting is that the mainstream media, including Fox, with the exception of Tucker Carlson, that actually pointed it out in his program the next day. But there again, it's just not these two parties. It's the media as well. I mean, and they're making sure that there is no commentary, no debate. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, she did win delegates And I think it's the first time in memory, at least in my lifetime, that a candidate that won delegates during a primary, she wasn't given a place to speak at the convention. I mean, they are very adamant not to let the cat out of the bag on this one, which belays the fact that the voting public for 3 election cycles said they want an end to this. This is an affront to democracy. Go ahead, George.
Yes, it is. But the fact is that we have these elections. We go back to the 2000 election and George W. Bush, who promises a humbler America.
No nation building.
Yeah, we go to Barack Obama, 2008. He says, well, you know, his basic platform was Iraq was a terrible mistake, and I was against it. That was his essential qualification for that job. I was against Iraq. Hillary Clinton and John McCain were for it. So that's it. Therefore, I deserve the presidency. So that was Barack. And then, of course, we had Trump in 2016. But in every case, not one of these 3 presidents has done anything to pursue the agenda that they had promised. What was Obama's first act? His first act was to appoint Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State. So much for his anti-war credentials. And then again, if you look at Trump had made no moves to hire anybody who is within that kind of anti-interventionist, isolationist wing of the Republican Party, or at least kind of intellectual. Rand Paul didn't get a job in the administration. John Mearsheimer, Stephen Wald, Stephen Cohen. You can list a bunch of people who have been writing for years, arguing against interventionism, arguing in favor of a working relationship with Russia. Trump didn't bring any of these people on, and instead he hired a bunch of hawks. The only one who might have been, closer to the kind of non-interventionist wing was Flynn, and Trump did nothing to save him. He was pushed out, and Trump just said, "Good riddance." So, yes, we've had these election cycles, and we have politicians making all the right noises. The moment they're in office, they immediately embrace the deep state, if you want to call it that.
John, it seems to me that Trump just essentially has kind of given up on that. I mean, what he wants is I would say a muscular presentation. He wants to look strong, but he's come to some kind of realization that he doesn't have the political capital to really go and clean up house. I mean, he had Fiona Hill. We had this Vindman character. I mean, openly defying the commander in chief. And we all learned that very fanciful phrase, the interagency consensus, which again is an assault on democracy, because essentially what we learned through this ridiculous impeachment trial is that foreign policy is off the agenda. That the voters are not wise enough, intelligent enough, informed enough, which probably is true because they're never told about it. Okay, very little of American foreign policy ever really makes it into the mainstream media, except for Iran is the biggest exporter of terror in the world. Israel is the only democracy in the middle, and all these other cliches that you hear all of the time, and are never really challenged here. So essentially, foreign policy is just not part of the democratic process, and just suck it up.
Well, it was at the center of the political battle, maybe not the democratic process, but as we all know, the first Trump presidency has been dominated by Russiagate. Of course, I understand what George is saying about presidents being sucked in by the deep state. Firstly, by the way, I never use the word deep state. I just call it the state because it's the army, the Pentagon, the CIA, the Congress, and to some extent the judiciary. In other words, it's nothing to do with the deep state. It's literally just the state. And indeed, one of the conclusions that, again, we as observers we must draw from the first Trump, from this presidency, is the relative weakness, it seems, of the president of the United States against all these other parts of the state. I mean, after all, that's the separation of powers and so on. But I am going to hold out for him a little bit because once again, I'm totally lucid, I think, in my criticism of him, and in particular of the 2 points that I raised in my first answer. But within, that having been said, and within the parameters of what apparently is or is not possible in the American state, there's a very important difference, apart from the fact that Trump has been at war with this state or deep state, as we know. There's another very important difference, and that does concern Russia. He hasn't, of course, managed to cozy up to Russia, but he wanted to. He said from the very beginning, why don't we get on with Russia? It would be great if we did. But where I think Trump, to be fair, has been, I would almost say, visionary, is, of course, in his instinctive hostility to China from the very beginning of his presidency. And obviously, he's with the coronavirus and so on. And his hostility to China on trade at first, and now, of course, on the coronavirus, implies better relations with Russia. And on that, he is totally at war with the deep state or with the state, because the consensus has been for the last 20 years that, on the contrary, China and America must run the world economy as a sort of condominium, China providing the manufactured goods and America printing the dollars to pay for them. But on that issue, he tore up the rule book. And again, we have to note that and say that is a big difference between him and his predecessors.
Yeah, but George, we've talked about this so many times, and I agree. I mean, I've made it very, very clear to people, even people that very vehemently disagree with me. I said, Russia and the United States do not have to be friends. Why? This is politics, but we should never be enemies. That is an important point here. And I agree. Trump saw something, visionary was the word. I agree with that, okay? But Russiagate, in my mind, was a way to keep the progressives on board with the conspiracy theory. Because that was one way to keep the left together, is Russiagate, okay? And then if we set that aside right there, because Russiagate was pursued with such vigor, is that we have seen the finishing touches of a Russian-Chinese alliance, okay? Exactly what should not have happened in terms of geopolitical interest for the United States. The United States this is on the level of Iraq, a foreign policy blunder that cannot be really fixed. I always tell people that the horse is bolted the barn. It's gone, okay? It's not going to come back, all right? So finish it up for us here, George. This bipartisanship, in the way I look at it, and I'm really glad that John brought up China, because the geopolitical chessboard is changing radically, though you wouldn't know that from American media and think Tankistan in America. And people are missing the boat. I mean, the Middle East is a geopolitical backwater. It has no real geopolitical value whatsoever. And we have the rise of China, or the return of China, as they would say it. And the United States is completely flat-footed. It doesn't even know how to counter a Chinese military threat, because it's fighting, quote-unquote, counterinsurgency in the Middle East for other people. Go ahead, finish up, George.
Well, yes, the problem is that the hope of an American-Russian alliance against China, in the kind of as a reverse of the Nixon-Kissinger policy of America aligned with China against the Soviet Union, I think that's just gone. Yep. I mean, Russia is not going to be stupid enough to trust the United States as an ally when it's already built a very extensive commercial, financial relationship with China. And now, given the instability of American politics, when out of the blue, suddenly the Democrats conjure up this wild conspiracy of Russia swooping in and stealing an election. Why would Russia do something so foolish as to align itself with a United States that can just make these drastic reversals, within 48 hours? So I think that's impossible now.
There's going to be the new conspiracy is that the Kremlin controls the U.S. postal system. That's the next one here. That's it, gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining the Gaggling here. Thank you, John. Thank you, George. And we'll have a whole lot more.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.